Right, I'll start now. Ready? Hello, Fast on my end. Welcome to the youth political podcast that is PolitiBabble, where this week we're joined by a guest and we'll be discussing whether women are being failed by the justice system.
I'm Oliver, and as usual, I'm joined by my wonderful co-host Archibald, as well as today's guest panellist, Graihagh.
Hi.
Hello. Yes, so we're back for yet another week of PolitiBabble, as is usual here on the podcast. And for some reason, my headphones today are being very echoey, so it's quite interesting experience. So our question of the week this week is: are women being failed by the justice system? So, but first, as usual, we do start off by asking all of our guests, if you were a cake, what cake would you be?
So I was thinking about this. It's quite difficult, but then I thought, I think I'd be a Jaffa cake. Like, they're undeniably delicious, but they're like slightly controversial.
Are they a cake? That's the real question here, I suppose.
I mean, I think they are. That's why I said it. But they are controversial, yet undeniably delicious and vegetarian, and I think that describes me quite well.
Oh, I forgot they're vegetarian. Yes.
Yeah.
Wow,
that's great.
I didn't know that. It's like Oreos. They're vegan, aren't they?
Are they?
Because everyone's like, well, they've got the cream in the middle, but no, they are vegan apparently. But we've had this conversation before when someone said, I think they said I'm a cheesecake, and we argued, and then we went on to say, is it a pie and is it other things? But yeah. Interesting.
It is interesting indeed. Yes, I suppose Jaffa cakes they are rather good. Although I'm controversial and class them as a biscuit because they're not cake-like enough for me. Yes.
According to the lawsuits, they are a cake, so I stand by my choice, frankly.
Yeah. Well, yes. Anyway, we do go on to our question of the week, where are women being failed by the justice system? It was quite a interesting way to get a topic, because it's such a broad topic. To get a title from it is quite interesting to extract. So obviously we've seen lots of events in the news and all over social media stories on kind of women and those issues within the justice system, and kind of maybe speaking about the fact that they could be failing by the justice system, or even there's been lots, especially in the news since the Black Lives Matter movement especially took much provenance in the US, even though it's been going on for much longer. Last April, we saw obviously a lot being anti-police in that matter, with I think ACAB being a very, very popular hashtag all over Twitter. So yes, we do move into this topic. We have a wide variety of in-depth discussion here. So I think, Greg, did you want to start off with a relatively recent event?
Yes, so I think that this issue has been particularly brought to light with the tragic murder of Sarah Everard. It was so shocking in its tragedy, frankly. A woman walking home, it seemed such an unassuming thing, and the fact that she was murdered by a police officer, I think it does make any woman, or I hope any person, question the reliability of the police, and especially in the light of the police's advice around it. You're thinking, the police have an understanding of what it takes to be a woman in today's society. I'd argue from their advice, I don't think they do, frankly. But it does call into question, I think, a bigger debate around the justice system and its treatment of women, frankly.
Well, I think we can all agree it is obviously a tragic murder.
Definitely.
Definitely.
Because again, that's where I think comes back to the root of the point. We have the option to look at, maybe say the justice system was the part which failed because it was a Southern police officer that killed her, or whether it is just the criminals that really caused it. And in that respect, I think that does lead us on to obviously like the question: are all police bad? That's been a very pertinent question, which again was raised even further in that. So Oliver, what do you think on the issue of policing? Do you think that it is right that, yes, although some argue it is a small number of police officers, others argue it is almost the institution that's wrong? Where do you stand on this?
Well, obviously, there's always going to be problems within everywhere, problems of people, sort of corruption and all sorts. But I don't believe that all police are bad at all. That's where I stand on that. I believe that the good majority are perfectly reasonable people. Graihagh.
So
it's rather like pass to parcel here.
This is a bit,
Yes.
I don't believe that they're all malicious murderers. Of course, that we just know that's not the case. But I think obviously bad is quite subjective. But I'd argue that many of them are complicit in some of the objectively horrible treatment of minorities that goes on. I don't want to say that makes them all bad as such, but I think there is a lack of awareness of the lots of injustice that goes on.
What would you suggest that maybe would change in the justice system then? Because obviously we can look at there's obviously more that can be done, and with anything really, to make something a better service,
Of course.
and better serve the community. That's always a good case. But what can we actually do? Because we see a lot about. I think we see this even within business now. We see, or even with schooling, they have a lot of. I think it's anti-bias training, and I can't see it doing anything necessarily. Some argue that yes, it does have an increase, but those who are going to have that bias anyway, they're going to keep that bias. You can't rule out, in my view, an inherent bias. Or if they are actually generally just prejudiced, you can't say stop being prejudiced. This is wrong. They're hardly going to change their views that it's suddenly prejudiced. So what would you suggest as a solution there?
Well, on the talk of like bias training, I don't think that it's people in roles that need to deal with bias and kind of the elimination of such. I don't think, or I hope that the people that have such large prejudices should be in those roles. I think it's more addressing the unconscious biases that we all have. I know I have them. I've done this test that it shows you like a series of pictures and scenarios, and it tests who you naturally kind of are drawn towards. And so I think it's more becoming aware of that than it is addressing like the rampant misogynists, because obviously you'd have to do a lot more than just unconscious bias training to rule out those. It's more like bringing light to the facts we might have unconscious biases that we're not aware of. But in terms of the justice system as a whole, I think it's more an issue of kind of redressing the balance of power. I think that with any power given that police officers have, there's the opportunity for the corruption of it. And I'm not saying that all police officers corrupt their power, but I'm saying that with such power comes the opportunity for corruption. So to maybe not eliminate that, but to lessen that, I think there should be more of a focus on the roots of crime itself. Maybe taking some money away from the amount of money that goes into the police force and putting it more into rehabilitation schemes, education in like impoverished areas. I can't think of anything more on top of my head, but yeah, addressing the roots of the crime before it happens to take some of the pressure off police, because I do think that's an issue that sometimes when police don't maybe perform to they're not completely in line in terms of legality, that an element of that is pressure. So taking that off and putting more of the spotlight on stopping the crime from happening rather than punishing.
It's interesting that you mentioned the corruption aspect, because
Yeah.
it is then almost the argument, should we ever give anyone power? Because in that case, I entirely agree with you, power can always be corrupted. There's always
Definitely.
that possibility. But if we then say we should, how do you manage and regulate the power? We have obviously the IOPC, which is the Independent Police Conduct organisation. I've forgotten the full acronym's expansion term, but it's basically the Independent Police Conduct Office. A bit like if you watch Line of Duty, AC-12, that's a more pop culture reference, which probably isn't pop culture. I'm using the total wrong language there. But there is that level, I'd say, of corruption training. But even if I think police are starting to realise they need to work on stopping the roots of crimes. They're looking especially, I think, at the moment at the county lines, obviously straying a bit away from our original topic. But they do look at that original stopping of crime, because obviously they don't. if you speak to police officers, they don't want to put people in jail. They don't want to go and arrest people. Obviously, of the minority, which are very egotistically driven, but they exist in all realms of society, really. But lots of them really just want to help society. So I think it's interesting you mentioned those schemes there. But could that not be worked in with the police, within all that side of law enforcement, to maybe make it both dealing with crime, dealing with the effects of crime, but also maybe looking at making them more community focused in that regard?
Yeah,
as we see, I think you'll hear community policing.
Yeah, I agree. You can't really separate the two. But I think that there has been almost a slight demonisation of the police, which I'm not arguing for or against. I'm arguing in recent years. I think that has happened. In terms of, I saw a statistic the other day that women who are victims of sexual assault are less likely to go to the police because they don't feel like it will be treated seriously, or they feel embarrassed. There's a whole host of reasons why people don't report it and go to the police, and I think that shows that they fear that women don't report rape because some reasons they don't feel like people would be sympathetic. They didn't think they'd be believed. Didn't think it would help. They fear embarrassment or humiliation, and some just dislike the police, according to a BBC statistic. And I think that shows that general public opinion, at least of women, is moving away from the police. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that seems to be the case. And so, if the police's presence is dwindling, I think we need to focus on other areas in terms of policing, and therefore move money/resources away from the police and into areas that it effectively does become community policing, but just with the less kind of domineering stance of a police officer.
How
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I can see the point of looking at maybe making police a bit more approachable. I always know when whenever you're driving or you're just passing by and a police car passes you always have that twinge of, have I done something wrong? Even though you know you've done absolutely nothing wrong, there's always that twinge inside. Have I actually done something that contributes? Are they going to pull me over? Even though I know I'm following with the letter of the law with driving. But we do look at if you look at that aspect of maybe looking at, obviously, rape, for example, or other sexual assault. In that regard, even if you're looking at them not necessarily reporting them, how it's very hard, I suppose, on the police end, if you look at, obviously, conviction rates, because you're looking at it and you're almost saying, if there isn't the evidence there, what then do you do?
It is difficult. It's obviously one of the hardest ones to prosecute because of its nature. I think it's more, if we don't look at it from a legal point of view, are we frankly just justifying it? Like, what if we don't at least try? Are we leaving the victims? Because I don't think that services in terms of mental health, they're awfully underfunded in terms of support of victims, and if that, on top of a lack of prosecution, a lack of even going to the police, where does that leave women, frankly?
Well, if you're looking at, I thought I will have something to say here somewhere, but if you're looking at even looking at prosecution, you mentioned it is obviously very hard to prosecute these cases. You mentioned they're notoriously hard to actually gain the evidence and have enough evidence to make it prosecutable. But if you're even looking at that, we could then possibly, I think, at least in my view, something which could be implemented is looking at maybe adding that support service and treating them. Yes, we may not be able to get your prosecution, but we can still help, because obviously the woman, they may some of them are obviously false allegations. A minority are proven false. A minority are proven true. There's that big gap in the middle where simply you do not know. So it's surely better to offer that service, because I know if anyone around me who I know had that happen to them, I'd be outraged. So it's not something that I think is necessarily so split on the political spectrum. It's something which, it is all decent people. They don't want to see people being assaulted, even physical assaults. We see it all the time. I'll come to this later. But you're looking at it, and it's looking at maybe not the policing front. I wouldn't say it's the justice system necessarily failing women, because there's only so much that the justice system can do. They can't prosecute over an accusation, because there needs to be a burden of proof. Otherwise, I could say, Oliver murdered me. and even though I say Oliver murdered that person who died over there, and we can't necessarily have their burden of proof. But let's say Oliver murdered that person over there and I'm distraught because of it. I should then get support because I still honestly believe that, and that's something which needs to be dealt with. So, yeah. I'm not sure if we disagreed so far on this topic, but...
Yeah, it's just going back to a statistic you said earlier. It's according to the Home Office, in the UK police, only 4% of sexual violence reported to the police are even found or suspected to be false. And if this is, even that statistic implies an amount of evidence that they have to suspect something to be false. So that implies that 96% are suspected to be true, which implies an amount of evidence they have.
It depends. It depends if we follow the legal protocol of innocent until proven guilty, because that's ultimately, I think, a key pillar of Western society. We have that ability in court. You have to have a burden of proof, but I think it doesn't necessarily suggest that I think it's just they don't know. They can't say it's false and they can't say it's true. There's a giant gap.
According to the Home Office, they are 4% of sexual violence. This is the UK police are found or suspected to be false.
Yes, suspected to be false, but you can't suspect something whether you know it's neither true or false. You can't suspect either way.
That's true, but the facts. Where does that leave the 96% of cases found or suspected to be true? That implies there's more evidence to say that they are true, which I'd argue gives you at least some legal standing to say in court. If you can find a statistic that suspects something to be false, that means you can suspect something to be true. And if you can suspect something to be true, I'd argue that gives you at least some legal standing to prosecute.
I suppose we can move this into an analogy rather than obviously this very hot, controversial topic in a way where we do risk certain aspects of being cancelled over Max Twitter. But if you look at we can take an extrapolated example here.
Well, I was just gonna. You can carry on. I had a point I'd like to raise. Well, I was looking through an article earlier and it had an interesting quotation I thought would be quite nice for you guys to reflect on. So it says, I don't know whether I've sort of pulled this in too early or whether we want to discuss it later, but it's just an interesting point and we can refer back to it later on. It says, it has been long acknowledged that our criminal justice system was originally designed by men, for men, and that it is largely dominated by men. As a result, women get slotted into a framework that treats them like men and fails to recognise some key differences and complexities, and that was by Professor Jackie Turnson of the Sussex University. I think does sociology or something, but I thought it was a really interesting quotation. Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
I completely agree with it, frankly. I think it's a fact that it was created by men just because of the patriarchal nature of history. I think that all high power jobs were, and to an extent still are, created by men. I frankly I don't know how you'd argue against that. We can see from history that women just weren't in those positions of power.
Clearly if it's been set up by men, then there's been no acknowledgement for women, and that's probably why victims of these cases are so badly treated.
Definitely, that's what I think, and I do think that women, because it was created by men and is still dominated by men, the focus is on men. I think that as a result of the patriarchy, I think men do suffer as a result of that. That like sentences for women tend to be less harsh because of children. They feel that men can't be the caregivers in the family, and that's a result of the patriarchy, that they don't think men should be the caregivers, and that's arguably a discrimination against men.
But surely that benefits women. So if we're arguing here that you're looking at the criminal justice system was made by men, surely men would then why would they then give women lenience? And if you're looking at that, if you're looking at, obviously, men face harsher sentences, men are more likely to be sent to jail, men are, again, more likely to become the victim of a violent crime. We see in London there's a heavy increase of stabbing. I wouldn't want to walk out on the streets of London at night. I'm at a high prevalence in the age bracket where I would statistically be likely to be killed if there was an attack. So if you're looking at that, I don't think you could say you can't overall say the criminal justice system is then disadvantaged against women, because women receive much less lenient sentences. If they're pregnant, they're very unlikely to face a jail sentence, and if they do, again, it's because of the severity of the crime. They're again a lot less. They're more likely to, even if you look at bias, a woman in court is more likely to be believed in it as a witness. They're deemed as more reliable. We saw there was a case a few years ago. It's a Victorian anecdote. Again, it was a Victorian era when obviously the criminal justice system was developing, and it was a man would ask his daughter to testify because she's more believable than another man testifying for him.
Sorry, so that was in the Victorian times.
So even with
in the Victorian times. Hundreds of years ago. Your statistic is from hundreds of years ago.
It's an anecdote. But if you're seeing the generally, if you look at the statistic on bias, women are, if they are deemed more trustworthy in some cases. Again, in sexual assault cases, they're not. Again, it's that it changes. But I wouldn't say that the criminal justice system is inherently against women, because it is inherently, I'd argue, against men. But again, I wouldn't say it's caused by the patriarchy, because the patriarchy is focused on having male dominance in society. They wouldn't punish their own gender or sex in that regard.
So patriarchy is obviously male dominance in society, but it does manifest in other ways, in the ways that women are seen as housewives, which obviously is an element of male dominance, because if women are the housewives and men are the breadwinners, and obviously that comes with more power. So that stereotype of women being the housewives is manifests itself in court, because women are always and usually only seen as the caregivers, the people who raise the children. So therefore, that while that isn't necessarily it's still an element of the patriarchy, despite it not necessarily giving male power. It does still play into the patriarchy because of those stereotypes that have been put in place because of patriarchal society. I'd be interested to see some statistics about biases towards women in recent years, because I'm not aware of any of those. I think our perceptions of men and women have changed a lot since Victorian times.
There were not, again, Victorian was only an anecdote of a case when the criminal justice system was emerging, and that was, again, when you would argue that there was a more patriarchal society. But now we've seen women rise to the top of power in the UK. So we are, I argue, moving away from that aspect. But if we're looking at, even you said that there's not bias against women. Well, there is obviously bias. There's a bias because women, again, get shorter sentences.
Yeah, as a result of the patriarchy.
But I don't think we can base everything, again, off the patriarchy. It's just the system how it's done, and women are more statistically likely to care for the child because, again, if you look at work, you look at, again, later in life, and we even look at, I suppose, Jordan Peterson's, you might disagree with him, but anyways, he's giving a very interesting statement. I did more research into it, and he was saying, well, even if you look at the top law firms in the world, they want to retain their female lawyers because they're really good lawyers, because they're top of their field. You want to retain them, but after a certain amount of time, they would want to exit law because they realize it's such a hard career, and they realize there's more to life than work. So if we look at that aspect of society, we can't necessarily say it's all down to patriarchy that we see what we have today.
Well, you'd want to think about why women are feeling this pressure, I think, is implied, to leave work.
I wouldn't say there's a pressure to leave work. They have a choice.
They do have a choice, but you've got to think about nothing exists in a void. You've got to think about outside influences and pressures. That I'd argue that there is such a pressure on women to kind of fulfill this societal expectation of the perfect woman is to get married, have kids, raise a family, and society isn't geared up for women to sustainably do both. So you've got to give up one, and in a heteronormative society, it's expected of the man to keep.
But surely, if we look at this case, a man can't give birth, so a woman then has to, surely there must be some break for them to have a child. They can't just exist and then not have a child, and then the mother. There is an inherent connection between a mother and a child. based there. But let's say then they want to stay at home, or there's plenty of stay-at-home dads now. It coexists.
But there's not an equal maternal and paternal leave. It's much less likely to get equal maternal and paternal leave.
But I think the paternal leave has gone significantly up.
It doesn't mean it's equal though.
No, but it has gone up since compared to what it used to be.
That's true.
There's been some countries where they decided that there's a maternal and paternal leave. Again, there's two parents, and the one which wants to stay home and caregive, they get the longer one. The other gets a shorter one. I think that's again the system, but they shouldn't necessarily be the same, because otherwise you're looking at a workforce where then you're cutting out. If they're not caring for the child and they're not going to continue to care for the child, they can get back into the workforce, and their career isn't they're not out of the work for 6 months, and then in 6 months a lot changes within major industry, and they're not necessarily then the top of their game. So again, we're looking at this. I wouldn't say that's women can choose to go at home and have a children. We've seen in the past 20 years it's totally changed how our society kind of operates in that regard. So I'm unsure as to how that again relates to a bias against women, because the expectation has, I'd argue, been removed.
I wouldn't argue it's been removed. I would argue that it's been lessened. We're seeing a drop in women choosing to have children, but I'd argue that there's still a massive pressure on women to. I mean, you hear about, like, in films and things, when women get to, I don't know, like 35 and pushing on 40, you hear about women being told their clock is ticking. You saw it in the new series of Sex Education, to bring in a pop culture reference.
Which I don't understand, because I've not watched it.
Have you not watched it? Oh,
no,
it's so
I haven't,
good.
yes.
I haven't.
Jean Milburn, played by Gillian Anderson, is an older mother, and that is frowned upon, frankly, because I don't know, she's seen as past her best, and I think that really highlights the view of women as kind of almost baby machines, I think.
But if you do look at it even biologically, women are generally, it is unsafe beyond a certain age. It gets more dangerous to have a birth. There are more likely to be complications. And obviously the biological clock does, in a way, exist. Menopause happens eventually. Mm-hmm. So if we're looking at this, again, yes, you could argue they're not a singular object of a baby-making machine. That'd be ridiculous to suggest. Mm-hmm. But in our society, they are the only one who can produce offspring and actually continue the human race. If they all said, well, I need my career, I'm working till 65, then I retire, I can have a family, we can't do it. We can't have that in society, because we then have no new population to actually take up the jobs and carry on.
Yeah, of course not. But I think that there's an assumption that women from, like, ages, I don't know, 25 to 35 want to have children, and they're asked about children, and the next step on from moving in with their partners are children. And I think that does either unconsciously or consciously put a pressure on women to fulfill that expectation. And I think that is part of the reason why many women leave early, leave the workforce, and that there aren't suitable provisions if they do choose to, off their own accord. There aren't suitable provisions for them to return back into the world, because the workforce has originally been built for men, and obviously they don't understand that, because they're not the birth givers, so therefore they don't really understand the provisions, and also sometimes, like, the mental toll it takes on a woman, and therefore don't give the necessary provisions for them to return back to work, which I think is why we don't see as many women returning to work, personally.
Do you just want to say all this? Sorry.
No, I don't. No. I don't.
Yeah, it's more just if women return. I think I have a view that I think I could probably quote Thatcher somewhere in here.
Okay.
But I can't place an exact quote, so I will refrain. And also, yes, yes, just see Graih's face there. But society is the building block, and it's like family is the building block of our society. We're almost looking at family kind of builds the societal functions. We even have it inside your own family, regardless of kind of you'll call it heteronormative or whatever word you attach to it. And family is still family, and that is again the building blocks of a society. You have that is a mini society within a society almost. That is a family. And I could quote: "There are no such things as society. There are individual women and men," as Thatcher said. But if you're looking at it. Having that family is very, very important. That family time is very, very important. So sending it's a woman returning to work, or even a man returning to work. Either parent, I'd argue it doesn't matter which one wants to stay home. But it's very important that caregiver exists in that early stage of development, at least till the child goes to school, because that's how they start to have their life. It's kind of the impression. That's the nature versus nurture is very, very important in those first few years. So I wouldn't say there needs to be suddenly an increase in provisions. There should just be looking at making our society more accessible to having children, and you're not having to send both parents to work.
Well, is that not an increase in provisions?
Well, it's increasing provisions to have to go back to work, to have childcare. You're then not having that connection in those areas is very, very important, I argue.
I'm not necessarily of provisions around childcare, provisions around mental health services, kind of a reduced time coming back. I think that well, actually, I think it has improved with COVID because people have started working from home more. But I think that's quite a big jump from just staying at home with a child to then going straight back into 9 to 5 work 5 days a week. And that obviously, I mean, to jump going back to school after the holidays, let alone like going back to work after having a child, I think that was probably quite daunting for women in probably a male-orientated workforce. I'd argue that in lots of fast-paced working environments, it is still male-dominated, and therefore that might seem quite daunting to women after such a long break from work, or men, but it is still mostly women who are staying home.
Well, I think I can see I can agree with the principle behind your point. I think that yes, it is obviously daunting to go back into that work environment, but if you're looking at it, I don't think it's neither a male nor female orientated workforce. It is a workforce orientated for business, because it's obviously the business and the company's responsibility is to return a profit to its shareholders. That's the ultimate form of business.
Of course.
You may disagree with that if you're an anti-capitalist, but if you're looking at that aspect, a business is there to make money, so it's not there to say, well, we need to get our workforce to return. It is focused on making its workforce work. That's the whole point of the company's structure. So it isn't necessarily based on, I'd say it's not made for the primary caregiver. It is made purely for the secondary caregiver, and that, again, in usual cases, it is the man, because that is how our society forms.
Exactly.
But I don't call a problem with that. It's the family's choice who chooses to work, who chooses to care.
Yeah. Of course. But as you said, the primary caregiver is historically and still to this day, I'd argue, a woman. I can't find a statistic.
Statistically, it is, but I don't see anything wrong with that.
Well,
no, of course not. Of course not. I don't. But the fact that women are the primary caregivers, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. But as you said, the workforce is catered for the secondary caregiver. That implies that the workforce is therefore catered for men, and do you not see an issue with that?
Well, I wouldn't say it's necessarily catered for men. It's catered for those who continue working.
You just said that.
But it's not catered for men, because that person can be of either gender. If the woman chooses to go back to work and the man stays back to care, it isn't catered for the man.
No, but the majority of primary caregivers are women, and therefore if a woman wants to break that mold and become the secondary caregiver, they are already an outsider, because that's not the usual thing to do, meaning it's much more difficult for them.
I can argue, I can extrapolate into analogy. I love analogies, if you've not noticed this yet. If you have a shelf and it's in a food store, and that shelf is mainly filled with fruit, and there's not vegetables there and there, well, it's not that shelf is catered for fruit. And the space is all for fruit. It's not, and it can fit vegetables. It's not catered for fruit. It's a bit of a weird analogy. It's catered to holding stuff. It's catered holding stuff. And again, it's catered for a workforce. It's not catered for the individual needs, because that's not the company's responsibility. I wouldn't say that it's just purely. It's statistical. It's. I wouldn't say the statistics are linked. Well, I can't see the argument for saying they're linked.
How? So if women are the primary caregivers historically, whether that be right or wrong, you said that they were, and that obviously the primary caregiver would take more time off work, as you said was the case, and work is you're not working if you're the caregiver, therefore it's catered for the secondary caregiver, whether that be man or woman, but statistically we see that to be the man. If men are the secondary caregivers, therefore there's more of them in the workplace, because the primary caregivers, the women on the whole, are at home, that makes a male-dominated workforce. there's a male-dominated workforce, with a woman kind of breaking that mould of being the secondary caregiver, they are entering a male-dominated workforce as an outsider almost, because they break that mould of not being the primary caregiver. Therefore, they're entering a workforce that doesn't really understand that they've had that child. They've gone through that mentally and physically quite draining experience, and therefore I'd argue that it makes it considerably harder for them to return to the workforce, because the majority of men have not gone through that, obviously. Therefore, I'd argue that they'd find that incredibly daunting, and that might put them off, because we don't have those provisions, because they're men.
Well, I think it's perfect time to sort of get us back on the topic of are women being failed by
Spoiling
the
the fun there, Oliver.
Well, we have deviated quite off topic, I might like to add. But there's been some fair points made across both parties, and I think that
Oliver likes to play the diplomatic role, but we all know outside the recording studio he's very hot-headed on his opinions.
Well, I'm sure soon we'll see the rise of Oliver coming in with some strong opinions, but they'll have to wait, and that's why you must carry on watching.
The off-air podcast, which you can purchase for an additional £99.99 from me. Yes, T's and C's apply.
Because
sorry, Oliver, how are you bringing back? It's your link.
Yeah.
It's your link.
So we've talked about
pay being doctor.
okay. So we've said we haven't really said, but did we discuss this on should sexual harassment be criminalised? And we've got a few more points here to raise, but do you have much further to add on these comments?
About sexual harassment being criminalised? Well, it's already criminalised in the workforce to a certain extent, which one of the main arguments against it being criminalised is that it is hard to criminalise. But I think that the fact it's been the very fact it has been criminalised in certain environments means it can be criminalised in more environments. I don't think it's an issue of morally should it be considered wrong. I think if anyone disagrees with that moral point of view, we have
severe problems.
We have an issue on our hands. It's frankly I can't see why it's not. For me at least.
Going on to rape prosecutions and allegations, do you believe they're taken seriously? And then we'll go on to sort of a review of the
question.
Of the question, yeah.
I don't think they're taken seriously at all, frankly. I think there is such a disproportionately heavy weight placed upon false allegations, at least in the UK. I know it's actually even a lesser percentage elsewhere, but it's only 4%, and even those haven't been proved to be false. I think while those happen, I'm sure they're devastating. It should not be our main port of call. And I think there was really interesting quotes from, God, I can't remember, a chair of a women's campaign that rape is effectively being decriminalised. The amount of reported rapes have exponentially increased in recent years, but yet not only the amount of them prosecuted, but the amount of them reported to the police have exponentially decreased. And I can't see any logical reason for that other than the fact that they're not taken seriously. I don't know. I mean, the only logical explanation I can see for such a big discrepancy is that they shouldn't be taken seriously. To answer the question of verification of rape allegations, I know that we do need to verify them just so we can prosecute them. Obviously, you can't prosecute that without evidence, but I think that it's a very fine line between taking evidence and almost putting women through their traumatic experience once more. You've heard horrible stories about people asking in court what underwear the woman is wearing, because according to them that plays a part in whether they consented or had ideas of whether that be going. And I think that this is almost inherent disbelief of women. It just shows that they don't take it seriously, and I do think it's a fine line to tread between needing to take evidence, obviously, but also almost putting women through the traumatic experience once more. We've had people talking to charities that help with women who've gone through rape and are trying to take it through the court system.
Well, I think there's definitely the point there that it's ridiculous asking them what they're wearing, etc. Because that can't criminally define whether something happened or didn't happen.
Yeah.
Unless it's obviously, were you wearing a yellow jacket? Yes, a witness saw, etc. etc.
Of course.
But looking at it, even when you mentioned false allegations there,
Mm-hmm.
I can't. Again, regardless of what we think, false allegations is obviously ridiculous. I mean, I think it's not right to prosecute someone on a really low boundary of evidence, because there's been cases where that's then been overturned, and even if we look at it, the amount it can again be done, I think it would be safer. There'd be less worry against false accusations if the person wasn't named until they go into a case. We even see that in Justice in the Isle of Man. We have someone on 3FM naming and shaming all the petty crime when they're not being convicted.
Yeah,
it's before they're getting convicted. And other times, a woman was
a court
then
report, isn't it?
A woman then was acquitted, and that will forever stay on the internet that she was charged with something ridiculous.
Yeah,
and it can ruin lives. Any sort of allegation.
Certainly can. I definitely agree with that. And I don't think that that should be the case.
Not.
People are innocent till they're proven guilty, and to have that stamp marked on the internet and or to people of the public, it is simply not fair.
Of course not. No, definitely not.
I think definitely more can be done on looking at those who haven't achieved prosecution, but also haven't been proven false. That then does need still a level of support, because we see again I think that's the main distress, that they're not being given any support. I think that would
definitely
alleviate that anger in that area, whilst not again providing much cost to the exchequer, and those then will recover and return back to the economy, and that will again be prosperous economically. So I'd argue there's definitely economic arguments even beyond the moral responsibility there, because it is awful, and we can't, no one can defend any sort of assault.
No,
but I think it's more we have to be careful about looking at what is true and what is false, and looking at the burden of proof. I think is key. But you're looking then at also, you're talking about sexual harassment being criminalised. I think to a degree certain types can be. Others, again, they're virtually impossible to prosecute, because it depends what you define. It was the UN study, which was heavily popularised on Parcel Squares. Everything seems to be on Parcel Squares where I see information. I see alternate Parcel Squares, which are from the opposite side. Everyone started using Parcel Squares now, basically. It's become the new way to share information. But if you're looking at the statistics, there was something where I think it was... I've forgotten. No, there's one part where it made a big... there's a criticism against how it was collated, because obviously the number was ridiculous. It was very, very high, about 97 or 96, but then some of it was just being looked at, and I don't think, again, I can't see that being criminalised, because I could look at someone, they view it as harassment, and then I get charged and put in jail or fined. Then that can't. There's certain aspects where yes it can, but there's a limitation. So I'm not sure where you place those limitations, but there's limitations. But to answer the overall question, as I think is probably pertinent to do,
definitely.
I don't think the justice system is inherently failing women. I think the justice system has its flaws and it has its benefits. It both fails men and women in different areas. There's no one where it fails men, it usually benefits women, and vice versa. It doesn't necessarily, or it fails them both generally. So I think the justice system can be obviously improved, and we can look at, as I've mentioned, maybe looking at that moral level of support for those who feel they haven't been given any support, and even victims who've had their allegations proven true still haven't been given support. And I think that's something which is quite interesting to see, how we're like, yes, thank you for coming forwards. It's hard for them to come forwards, but we're not going to help you anyway. It doesn't seem helpful, because you need professionals to deal with it. Again, your general average Joe won't be able to know what on earth to do, apart from provide a shoulder to lean on. So I think it's more, the justice system isn't inherently failing women. It's more the lack of evidence, which isn't a failing of the justice system. I think as science improves, we start to see the conviction rates go up on certain things. As DNA recognition becomes available from a single speck of hair, it's become quite amazing what science can do.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it can be improved, but it's not inherently failing. I'm not sure. You can go on to answer the
Great.
interesting question.
Obviously, I disagree with you, Archie.
Surprise,
I do
surprise.
Think, yeah, I do think that it does fail men, and it fails kind of minorities of both men and women, and more because of unconscious bias. But I do think it disproportionately affects women. There was just a target that I forgot to mention earlier that so the CPS had a target of a 60% conviction rate for rapes in 2019. That was their target, and spoilers, they didn't hit it. They have never hit that. But it led to officers being told to drop weaker or more challenging cases to ensure conviction. I think that just shows that it leads to
ridiculous.
It leads to a prioritisation of statistics over justice, and the fact that women are incredibly more likely to be raped, and men are 98.5% of rapists are men. I think that statistic, that prioritisation of statistics and how they look to the public over the justice for women, if that doesn't show a failing of the justice system on behalf of women who've gone through that traumatic experience, I don't know what does.
Well, I think there is the case which is becoming. There's an interesting study done, and it's becoming more researched about. Is obviously the opposite of female raping, women raping men, and again that's not very at all reported because men, it's demasculizing almost. It's again it's not very talked about. But I think you do make an interesting point that maybe I'd say it maybe the justice system just fails people then overall. But it's something which I think definitely needs to be worked on, and I can agree totally with your statistical thing. We shouldn't be focusing on prosecutions from a statistic because it's dangerous in both senses. It means you prioritise the cases which are easy to win, and you also can, if before the PACE Act, if you had that statistic, police would make up confessions to gain prosecutions to look good. It's not the way to do justice.
Of course not. Of course not. But I think your statement of it fails people is quite flawed. The prosecution rates for crimes that are still hard to prove. Oh gosh, I've got to think some off the top of my head now. But crimes with little evidence, rape. Basically, what I'm trying to say is rape and sexual assault are the lowest prosecution rate in relation to allegations, and obviously that's rape disproportionately affects women. And I think that if it affected people, we would see if the justice system just disproportionately was affected people in general negatively, we would see all crimes with a low evidence rate having low prosecution. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing a disproportionate bias against women, and that, for me, that shows that it's not just it does harm everyone, but it disproportionately harms women, in my opinion.
Oh.
Well, I think you've both made some to try and wrap it up here.
Why is he so diplomatic?
Of course.
Oliver, crikey, have some opinion.
No, I believe you both make really fair points. But I wouldn't say it. I would say to some degree it is failing women, but I don't believe entirely that it is. Definitely in the way that when women are the victims of things, they are not treated fairly at all in most cases. So yeah, that's where I stand on it. But I think it's now time for us to move on to our current affairs section of the show. So we're going to now have a roundup of this week's Isle of Man news. So the new Council of Ministers has been revealed. Face coverings are expected in Manx schools, and the DOI Minister, Tim Crookall, won't give nightmare deadlines. Island gas prices have rose by 27.5%. That's it really for Manx news this week. It's been a very interesting one. So first of all, we're going to start off with the new Council of Ministers being released. It was unfortunate that it was released on the Friday, so we couldn't fit it. Obviously, we had our last episode.
Come on,
on
Coleman.
Thursday.
What's we paying you for?
Yeah.
Come on. You're supposed to release it on time so we can talk about it.
So obviously, it's a little bit delayed now, but not all of you may or not know. But yeah, we have a new Coleman. Obviously, it's been branded over the past 5 years as Coleman, as it's I know it had one woman in it,
And then she resigned.
Yeah. For a period of time in health and social care, but now we have a completely different Coleman. With Alfred Cannon obviously leading it as the Chief Minister, as we were discussing last week. We now, for the first time ever, actually have a designated deputy Chief Minister.
Jane Paul Wilson.
Yes, former
Love
MLC.
Jane Paul Wilson.
Jane Paul Wilson, who is also the Minister for the Department of Home Affairs and Justice. So she's going to be the sort of deputy to Alf. I think they've realised that we should put in a deputy. I think it's really arose in the times of COVID. Obviously, Alf did kind of stand in for Howard in
It's
the
always
last
important.
term, but it's a good idea, especially if someone went into unfortunate circumstances. But no, it's really interesting to see Jane put in that position. We had obviously two former ministers. No, well, they are ministers still, but of the last administration, moved to different departments. Firstly, many of you will be familiar with David Ashford, the health minister, who is now the Treasury Minister. You have the other candidate for Chief Minister, Dr. Alex Allinson, moving to the Department of Enterprise, which was a very interesting move. A lot of people saying he should either stay in education or move to health, where his background is. But then many people have argued it'd be a conflict of interest. But he in an interview with Sam Turton from Jeff the Mongoose, when he was talking about his new ministerial position, he did say it was either stay in education or move to DFE, Department of Enterprise. That was his sort of decision. But I do find it particularly odd that he's moved to the Department of Enterprise. But I can see with his interest in
It's so you can do
in medicinal cannabis and other things. But I did find it interesting how, for instance, he moved there. We obviously saw the public outcry of Rob Callister, who wanted a ministerial position, not to get one.
I think that it was a bit snide of him to say, "Oh, I was disappointed." It's kind of that's just you just don't say that in politics.
Yeah.
It's not the done thing.
And he said
yes.
and he said that the way Alf was approached wasn't very. I can't remember what he said.
He was complaining.
Yes, he was basically complaining, but. The new Council of Ministers is a really different one, and I don't know where we'll see.
I think, but it aligns quite well behind Alf's strategy, which I think's good.
He said people that wanted to be in the Coleman had to envisage his strategy.
And it's quite good to mix in at least one political opponent. Because again, it keeps them under the wing and out of flaming and attacking you.
Anyway,
so it's always useful in that regard.
Your thoughts on the new Council of Ministers?
I'm very pleased Jane Paul Wilson got a place in Coleman in Coleman. I think she's great. I think the split of men and women is great. I thought it was interesting putting Allinson out of the public sector, but I do think he'll do well. He's very eloquent. He was my choice for Chief Minister. Frankly, I think he'll do very, very well because, frankly, I think he'd do well in most roles. Who else? Yeah, I thought it was interesting putting Ashford in Treasury. It was obvious he was going to get a place, but I thought that it was quite different from his role in health. So it'll be interesting to see what he does there. I think Alf will be like a steady force. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but yes.
Well, many people have described him as a Thatcher in trousers.
Thatcher's described as a man in trousers, but but again, I think Thatcher.
Well, that's the analogy that I've seen on several forums on the island.
If he is a Thatcher in trousers, then he is very good as our Chief Minister, I must say.
Well, there you go. That's your opinion, Archibald.
Yes.
Anywho,
The only opinion of the podcast.
I will quickly keep moving through our topics, but it's interesting and great to discuss them. It's one of my favourite parts of the podcast.
The DOI, I find that hilarious.
Yes.
Won't give nightmare deadlines, says the DOI, the department well known for giving in nightmare deadlines.
But then
ironic.
it's that sort of thing, which I heard on the Manning line this week.
Moaning line.
Anyway, and it was sort of that thing, well, if there's going to be no deadlines, then when's anything going to get done? You know, that's another example. But moving back to our previous story, Archie, which you managed to somehow skip, was...
Damn it! I have to bring COVID into it again, Oliver.
I'm sorry,
What were you
I had
gonna
to,
say?
but it's Archie, it's a very point at this moment in time. We are going through basically you could describe it as I don't know how many waves we've been through technically on the Isle of Man, but probably our fourth or fifth. This is we're going into another wave, and I see it sort of staying, because at the moment the government have not gone in with any sort of policy. They've said they're going to be discussing it this week, but before you know it, it's going to be too late. Archie, have you been wearing a face covering this week, which is expected? And Graihagh,
No,
have you?
I
You
have.
know?
I can expect. No, I have not. I find it utterly ridiculous.
You find it utterly
I do.
ridiculous. Why
we,
do you find
we
it
have,
utterly
we have now
ridiculous?
vaccinated the most vulnerable in society. We've now vaccinated the majority of the society. We're reaching herd immunity, and it's pointless to continue living our lives in fear. I do not.
But the cases and the
more-
cases and the hospitalizations are still going up.
I think we'll always see that. You see flu every year. You have the flu jab. Every year, people die from flu.
You've become a lot less sympathetic towards
I
COVID.
have. We've reached a stage where we've now vaccinated the population. It's more deadly than flu. We've vaccinated the population. We now can treat it like flu. If you're ill, you go off school. It's more pertinent, if you wanted to have a protection policy, to force students to do 2 lateral flows a week than wear a mask. Because if I'm not infectious, wearing a mask does not protect me.
So do you still believe
it doesn't
people?
protect me
Do you
from
still believe
having
that
things.
people on the Isle of Man that have COVID-19 should still isolate?
Well, if they have
And or
COVID-19,
should they isolate? If they felt ill, they should isolate for the period of the time that they feel comfortable with.
Well, I think now that we are seeing where we are moving towards a modern a new normal in a way. We should not be having to be forced to wear a mask. I think expecting students to wear a mask is ridiculous. How are they going to enforce it? They're making us sit very close together. Masks have absolutely no detriments, no benefit to my health. I don't want to get ill from COVID. A mask is not going to protect me from that.
Yeah, it's been interesting.
We've been vaccinated.
It's been interesting. I don't know whether in your school it's the same sort of case, but assembly sort of being cancelled again, but we're still gathering in a building. We're still gathering in big areas. You know, people warning over events sort of being cancelled.
Do you think we should wear masks, Oliver?
I do believe it's freedom of choice.
So, there we are. Hard question again. Not believing. Yes.
I do think you should. I don't think it should be.
Do you wear a mask in school?
I did wear one for a period of time, but I decided not to because I realised that so many other people weren't. So
And
I
they're so uncomfortable.
I realised it wouldn't be effective. But
They're uncomfortable to wear, and you can't
also-
hear people speaking properly.
But
so.
I also see it as, well, if a few of us are going to wear masks, then I think it's not going to be as effective if everyone wears a mask everywhere. You know, it's like the example of, it should be mandatory on public transport. But then you go to I don't know, let's say, for example, supermarket, you're all still gathering, and it's not enforced. I mean,
It's the disposable
it's still,
masks. The disposable masks annoy. They really, really annoy me.
Yeah, I saw one at the bus stop the other week, and I thought, I'm not going to pick that up because it's
People
that
just
sort of...
they chuck it on the ground,
Yeah.
and you're like, I can't touch that because I might
Yeah.
it's a health hazard. And there's so many just disposed. They fly into the ocean, and they kill sea life. It's not good.
Anyway, we saw the first Tynwald of the new administration and House of Keys, and obviously we had the proposal of whether the gas prices...
I had a fascinating Twitter argument the other night on that.
Yeah, I did see it was rather lengthy.
A few hundred tweets.
And now it was the members of Tynwald voting, and they basically all said, well, we had to vote against it, otherwise it could be a lot worse. So Ireland gas prices now rose by 27.5%, which is quite a lot. Yeah. And some I've seen one MHK sort of labelling it as keep your heating on this winter kind of thing, and I suppose it's that there is going to be support for people on low incomes to support them over this time, but it is unfortunate. But obviously, gas prices are rising everywhere extortionately. So I suppose in one way that they do have to go up. Yeah. Anyway, DOI minister won't give nightmare deadlines. Yeah, we've sort of looked at that. I can see where he's coming from, because it was that idea with it's going to be done by this time, but then it's not, and it keeps getting delayed, which annoys people. But then there's going to be an expectation that nothing's going to get done if you don't give nightmare deadlines.
Well, the department's paying, therefore the department should get what it's paid for. If you look, even if you look at the prom, it's ridiculous taking so long. The contractor's gone over what they proposed, and there's no financial cost.
The contractor was clearly not suitable for undertaking that project.
Them in an oven. Sorry, I couldn't resist the pun of the previous DI ministers.
Anyway.
Yes. Well, in international news, we obviously saw the very